Um, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here. For joining our AAJMC pre-conference on engaged journalism. I'm Andrea Wenzel. I'm an assistant professor at Temple University and a co-founder of the Germantown Info Hub project, which we'll talk about a little bit in a little bit. Letrell will talk about. And I'm here with my co-organizer, Jake.
Hey everyone, I'm Jake Nelson and I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University.
So we've got a really wonderful group of folks here today, particularly all of you who've joined us. And we're excited for this discussion focusing on how COVID may be shifting, how we think both about news quality and about sustainability. And before we dig into things, we want to go ahead and thank those who've sponsored this discussion, the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, Arizona State University, Temple University, the Agora Journalism Center at University of Oregon, and Northwestern's Medill School. So actually, did Paul, I don't know if there's I can't actually see. Did you raise your hand? I don't know. Because we're gonna go ahead and jump into the discussion, but if you wanted to jump in now, I'll mute myself.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Vokes from the University of Colorado, and it's been my pleasure to serve as the chair of the selection committee this year for the Jean Bird Research Award for Research in Urban Journalism. And Andrea and Letrell are far too modest to mention this on their own, so I just thought I'd make a quick announcement. Andrea and Letrell are co-recipients this year of the Bird Award. And under normal circumstances, they would be presenting their research at a panel, which has sadly been postponed to New Orleans, I guess. But the title of the research project is Connecting East Germantown, Strengthening Neighborhood Storytelling Networks. So I just want to say congratulations in this semi-public way. It's a wonderful research project, and under normal circumstances, I would be your discussant at a panel. So I'm also today, later on, in the process of preparing the committee's comments and questions for you too, which I'll just do virtually. Thanks for giving me a chance to make that announcement.
Thank you, Paul. That's very kind. Yeah. And Letrell, wave. We're going to say hi in just a minute, but there's Letrell. So we're going to go ahead and get started, I think. So the past several months, as everybody's all too aware, has shaken up many things with the pandemic and with also the uprisings over police violence. This has presented a lot of challenges, how to engage vulnerable communities with limited internet access. And it's also put a lot of pre-existing inequities and problems into sharper relief. And how, things like how can we have journalism that's more inclusive and how can we sustain it when the business model clearly doesn't work. So our hope today is to explore what we can learn from this moment and to think about what we can take away from it, particularly how we can, things related to the push for more equitable and inclusive local journalism systems and practices. We also want this to be an opportunity to connect many of you, some of you who come from different perspectives as researchers or as practitioners. So part of our goal is to connect you to each other. And in our second half, Jake will lead a discussion on how to pay for the great journalism that we want to see. He's going to dig into the public funding questions with two really smart folks grappling with this idea, Madeleine Bair of Free Press and Victor Pickard at the University of Pennsylvania. But first, we're going to talk about efforts to make journalism more responsive to communities and what we can learn from trying to do this in the middle of a pandemic. So in a moment, we're going to hear from Antoine Haywood and Mike Wassenaar, who spent many years working in community media in particular. But we're going to start off with Letrell Crittenden. Letrell and I collaborate on a number of research projects, and he's going to share today some of what we've been working on in the Philadelphia area. So I'll hand it to you, Letrell, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you, Paul, for those kind remarks. We will probably touch a little bit on what we would have presented in this presentation at the end, but bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. But again, my name is Letrell Crittenden. I'm assistant professor of communication at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And I am one of the co-researchers. That's the wrong button to hit, Letrell. I'm one of the co-researchers with the Germantown Info Hub. And basically, I just want to do a brief presentation. Yes.
Before you get too deep into it, I just want to let people know that we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A and for small group discussion. If you want to share any questions into the chat, please do so. And also, if you need to take a break at any point, feel free. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. And I'm just going to present this little slow slideshow, and I'm going to go really quickly just to make sure that we have time for anybody else. Can everybody see? All right, so it's really kind of a research project that came at the tail end of that really looked at issues pertaining to just building trust and other issues in news. And this is the actual study that was produced. You would actually look at this. It was basically looking at local news coverage in suburban Philadelphia and in Germantown. We're going to basically be focusing more on the Germantown part, but we are going to talk about the census. And that was through focus groups. We basically had people keep diaries and did interviews, and we asked people about their news and information needs. And again, when we say news and information and communication needs, we want to stress that the way that people communicate is not or gather information is not simply through news. It is very often through other means and channels. And we talked about what it would mean to actually have a better relationship with media. And what we found is that specifically in Germantown, this is a very history, a historic neighborhood, rich history, predominantly African-American neighborhood, and has a range of socioeconomic backgrounds. But it's seen a lot of disinvestment, and there are pockets of poverty. And what people got was the sense that the news overwhelmingly focused on all of the negative issues pertaining to specifically crime. And basically, you were getting to this point where people just simply felt they were not getting positive stories about the Germantown neighborhood. This is a quote from one of the actual participants in the study. So from there, while crime was key, and certainly in focus groups, people did want to talk about those types of issues, other things were not being covered. Gentrification issues, education issues, issues related to employment. And these were all different things that residents felt that they needed in their everyday lives to exist. And they simply were not being covered in local news. So there were a number of recommendations that were made in terms of improving news, solutions-oriented coverage. So basically, solutions-oriented news, solutions-oriented journalism, also participatory media, and actually having local residents participate in the production and distribution of news, and also having dialogue about issues across the community. Many residents simply felt that there weren't enough opportunities to simply talk about many of the issues impacting Germantown. So as a result, there were a series of additional workshops where we brought together journalists and community members to brainstorm ways on how to actually do something that would benefit the community. And after the conversations, the idea was the creation of the Germantown Info Hub. It is basically a project that tackles two separate goals. First, the idea is to improve circulation of information within the community. And that is not only through news coverage, but through different community discussions and other means that we're going to talk about. And then also strengthening that relationship between the media, news media, and journalists. In many cases, when you talk about issues of trust, it's because you don't have journalists going into neighborhoods and communities and talking about those issues directly and making themselves accessible to different neighborhoods. So that was one of the goals. So we've actually done a number of things pre-COVID and post-COVID to actually have this intervention. A lot of it is related to face-to-face interactions. So tabling, going out and meeting people at parks, bus stations, bus stops, coffee shops, wherever people were gathering, we would actually have a team that was set up with a community organizer that actually is a resident, longtime resident of Germantown, to actually just sit and talk to people and get their ideas on what they would actually like to have covered. There's also a number of classes at both Jefferson and Temple that have also supported this effort in terms of engaging directly. We've also used Ground Source as a service, texting service, if you're familiar. We can send a text that has information and people can correspond back and forth with us. And that has been one of the tools that we've used for engagement. We also are on Instagram and Twitter. And additionally, the main things that we really are proud of and things that we're really emphasizing are stories that focus on communities that provide a much more representative picture of the Germantown neighborhood. So these are a couple of community profiles that we've done. We also have done asset mapping, where we basically highlight where are those places that serve the information needs of Germantown. And that can actually be found on our website. And our website can be found at germantowninfohub.com. We also have done a number of solutions-oriented stories. This one happens to deal with an issue that's been in the one at the bottom is a major issue, which is getting fresh food in Germantown, and the idea of what are some of the things that can actually help with that. We've also done some accountability reporting, where we've talked about different issues and how different issues are impacting residents of Germantown. The thing that has been most successful has been, we have community discussions on a regular basis where we bring in community members to talk about different issues as they pertain and relate to Germantown. We've had some of the discussions we've had have focused on gentrification, trash, which is a major issue in terms of collection in the neighborhood, also gun violence and other issues. Additionally, we've actually had, in many of these conversations, journalists come in and share their actual news stories so that they can actually be held accountable for what they actually are producing. And we've had a lot of support from WHYY, a couple of other hyper-local entities in Philadelphia, and these have been highly successful as well. However, COVID hit. So we had to make an adjustment to connect with people on a regular basis in a different way. So we've actually launched a number of discussions online via Zoom. We also have, as part of the actual award that we won, we did a number of additional focus groups. And what we found was that one of the things that we really want to hope that we connect with more are sort of people we would call community influencers in the neighborhood. We're talking about block captains. We're talking about that person that everybody is following on Facebook. These individuals very often are sort of the hubs of information, and getting them involved in the process more will help us facilitate and distribute and connect people with information. Also, just getting, especially during this time, basic information that people need. So people can live their everyday lives or get the information that's required, particularly during this particular moment. And again, this flew through this, but if you would like to get some additional information, we certainly will be able to talk in Q&A, but this is a piece that was recently released focused on our research in Neiman. And then there's a couple of pieces that focus on Germantown and some of our other work in through the Tao Center. And certainly want to pitch Andrea's new book that provides a very detailed analysis of all of this and other communities. And with that, I will hit the stop share button and pass it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Letrell. Sorry for the shameless book promotion. There'll be more of that, I'm sure. Thank you, Letrell. So we're gonna have a moment to ask Letrell questions shortly, and please throw them into the chat if you want. But we want to hear about what Antoine Haywood and Mike Wassenaar have been working on. Mike is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Community Media, and Antoine is currently a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School after a long career in community media. They've been collaborating on research that explores how community access media centers are using participatory journalism practices. And I think it's really valuable for those of us who are in this engaged journalism space that we don't forget about community media and how they were sort of like doing this work before it was cool. They're like the hipsters of engaged journalism. So I'll let Antoine and Mike explain what they've been looking into.
Thank you. Yes, we're like the Steely Dan of engaged journalism, I guess you could say. So shout out to my records in the back. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in this. And and it's great to see so many friends, including my advisor, Victor Pickard, shout out. Yeah, when I started this, I reached out to Andrea and Jacob to say that I had I wanted to talk about the work that we were ramping up and looking at what community journalism practices look like at PEG. And this, of course, is coming off the article that I did with Letrell. My end of that article, I focused on PhillyCam. And one thing that I thought about is that, well, there's actually PhillyCam and PhillyCam Voices, which is a participatory news-making program that's been in operation for over 4 years, is just one example, and that there are many more that it would benefit people to learn about. And so that was towards the end of the semester. I was ramping up that project with Mike, and then COVID hit. So I had to make a pivot, and fortunately, right at the time when we made when COVID hit, Pat Ofterhide at American University called Mike and said, hey, we should actually do this study about how PEG is responding to COVID. And so it was serendipitous. And so I'm going to talk just give some highlights about that. Specifically, there's a major part of this study that is focused on the community news practices that PEG operations ramped up during COVID. Before I get into that, though, I want to just toss it over to Mike so he can real quick show something that's a valuable tool that would like the entire audience to see. One thing that we struggled with in doing research in community media and in community news practices that are happening at public education and government access operations is we just don't know, like, what is this? We've had an estimated number, but we really needed a firm data set. And so I'm going to toss this over to Mike to show you, this is another big research project that we're actually mapping out all of the access channels in the country.
Yeah, thanks, Antoine. I'm going to share the screen here. This is actually a community media directory that's probably about 2/3 complete at this point, just mapping out public educational and government channels throughout the United States. Right now we have over 1,100 entities that we've identified that are doing daily production of some sort. Whether it be community colleges, university media programs, nonprofits that are doing that work, or local governments, county governments, city governments, in some cases consortia that are like joint powers authorities amongst local governments. So we're thinking that probably by Labor Day, when the project is done, we'll probably have something closer to 1,500 entities, and the average number of channels that entities work on is actually a multiple factor depending upon the community that you're in. So, for example, in the New York metropolitan area, there's probably something like 30 separate channels that are operated by 10 different authorities, believe it or not, including nonprofits and community colleges. So we think that estimate of 3,000 channels is probably a solid number across the United States. In some places, the density is probably a lot higher than in others. Massachusetts and New England states probably have a lot higher density than, say, the Mountain West does because of a number of factors that we won't go into today. But this is like a data set that's going to be current as of Labor Day. We've been partnering with the National League of Cities and community media organizations across the United States to just map out television channels. I think the next stages of this are going to be to try to maintain the data set on a yearly basis so we have fresh available information for folks. One of the problems that's been occurring is when these efforts have been happening in the past, the data just simply disappears or goes old, or the organizations change over time and practice changes in local communities. So that's something that we're going to be trying to devote resources to in future years. And then I think probably also reach out to other forms of community media practice in terms of that mapping as we continue to maintain the data set. So, but that's available through the All Community Media site, which is our organization. So
yeah, and we can talk more about, I'm glad Mike is here, so we can talk more about just that aspect of it. And then also just what are the actual like news practices that we are seeing being picked up in these operations. Before I wrap, I want to just highlight what the news practices that we have found in this recent study with American University. And, you know, we sent out like the survey at the beginning in May, ran from May to June. There were 230 completed responses. We also did open-ended interviews with 10 practitioners in the field. And one of the, you know, people really indicated, and this, when I say people, I mean practitioners, really indicated that there was gratitude for the services that PEG has operations to provide in this time. And, but it's been a real challenge to sustain this work. And so one of the things that, I'm sorry, I could get my timer because I know Andrea's like, get out. So just to let folks know, if you want to see some examples of the outstanding news work that has been done during this time at Access Media Centers, please take a look at Davis Access Media in Yolo County in California. Philly Cam, of course, which has Philly Cam Voices. They produced an episode that focused on the pandemic and protests that was happening at this time. And these are community, like people trained from the community that are doing news pieces under the guidance of actually experienced journalists. Akuku Maui has some outstanding program. They aggregated a lot of their local stories on the island from people shooting with mobile devices, and they were training people remotely how to gather these stories, do some basic editing with sound voiceovers, and send that in back to get on the channel. The Rapidian is another example. Some people may have heard of the Rapidian as Grand Rapids Community Media Center, and it's an online, it's a news source, but they also incorporated video, doing daily updates. So you had a lot of places that were doing a lot of cross-platform communication to engage audiences. You had people who were doing more online training, of course. We didn't see a lot of folks that were doing immediate stories on COVID. There was more of like the stories that were on people that were tracking the protests that were happening. But what there was a lot of is the staff members who were working at PEG access facilities were ramping up their expertise to make sure that government meetings were being covered online, and also just doing daily updates. And so there was a lot of that where people were going on radio, they were using streaming services like StreamYard to go Facebook, YouTube, and they were also using their channels to do information updates. And this was definitely something that was valued and vital in areas where there are news deserts. So I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about this stuff. As everyone knows, I can just geek out about PEG all day with my buddy Mike. And the report that is going to be coming out at the end of the month. So, you know, please stay tuned for that. We'll make sure that it's shared far and wide. And we're also developing a journal article out of this information. So there's a lot of, you know, really, really relevant work that PEG operations are doing today. So thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. That's great. I'm going to open it up to some questions from folks. If you have any questions, you want to either raise your hand or throw it into the chat. We've got a question from Amy Merrick. I'd really like to hear more about how you're reaching communities with limited internet access at a time when public discussions are difficult. For example, what if you wanted to share information and resources about responding to an eviction notice, text messages, or something else? I don't know, Letrell, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure, that's one of the things that came out of our most recent round of focus groups is that certainly there are a lot of people who are connected virtually. And then there are a lot of people who are not. And even to this day, a lot of people, despite the risks, are actually still communicating in person or going door to door in order to connect with people or using phones to connect with people. So one of the things that we are planning to do more of is to actually have more paper production in terms of handing out flyers, going to different spots that are resources. We do have our texting service, but we've also talked and have groups in Philadelphia that are actually doing phone banking. And that's basically, you have this idea of calling people to see how they're actually doing, as opposed to simply being digital. So in this particular moment, you have to have all, by any means necessary, of actually dealing with people. You can't just simply virtual. Yes, you will not necessarily reach a lot of people, particularly for residents and people who are do not have the same access to technology. And that's one of the things that we certainly are hoping to really ramp up in the next few months with the Info Hub.
Thank you. Go ahead with another question here. Antoine and Mike, are you finding any collaborations between community and public media outlets in your study?
You know, we are. I mean, it really depends upon, you know, where the assets are and what the focus, particularly of the public media entity is, because some public media entities are very open to collaboration, some are not. Yeah, I think the most prominent collaboration that I could speak to actually goes back to the post 9/11 emergency communication efforts that happened in Minnesota surrounding public health communication, trying to reach out to communities that didn't have English as a primary language. The project was originally called Echo Minnesota. It originally had its roots in community health of Ramsey County, which is in St. Paul, and then it changed over to be housed at Twin Cities Public Television. Since COVID has arrived, they are co-producing COVID updates in 9 separate languages at the public access facility in Roseville, Minnesota. For many, many years, they actually had a partnership with my former organization, St. Paul Neighborhood Network. But Roseville actually has now become sort of the primary collaboration point. And they are actually providing public health communication, and they've done this for like 15 years now through this collaboration, specifically in communities that don't have a high degree of trust with local government or high degree of contact with local government. So it's a very, very interesting collaboration with trusted communicators in, who speak Amharic, Spanish, Hmong, and a host of other languages that immigrant and refugee communities rely upon. So it's a very, very interesting collaboration between Twin Cities Public Television and CTV Roseville.
Mike or Antoine, there's Jane added on to Jessica's question. What about commercial media partnerships? Have you been seeing any of those, like commercial newspapers or other outlets?
You know, from the practitioners that I've talked to, there are examples of where they'll have a columnist come in. I think this is out in Fresno, the media center out there. They had someone who had a column for a long time. That operation, in terms of the news operation, closed, and so the columnist came over and started to work with the community media center to start to reproduce what he used to do. There's also there are examples of operations that have, they have the editors. They may come by and they do like just regular, like weekly or monthly updates. They're just highlighting the stories. Out in you have some aggregation that happens through the field. I'm thinking like Akuku, and the hit of when COVID hit, they were doing a lot of like aggregating stories and working with other professional organizations that were on the ground. So there's a lot of, there are examples of that. And I also just wanted to add on to Mike's what he was saying in terms of the community, the public media collaborations with community media collaboration. There are, as we've been doing this research of counting access channels and operations in the country, I've come across some iterations that are very interesting. There's not a handful of them, but where is an operation that's based at a community college, and that community college also has the license, has the public media license, but they also generate content locally. And so they may run some city meetings, they may run some school meetings, as well as then on the other end, they're doing like PBS stuff. And then they have student-led productions, which is pretty fascinating.
But the one other thing I want to amplify, or maybe sort of like add on to Antoine's point about the newspaper collaboration particularly, is that the response that we're seeing with some of these centers is particularly because of the closure of the weekly,
Yep.
right? So,
Yep.
so the collaboration depends upon having excess time and excess capacity, and a lot of these organizations are strapped for time and labor. And what's happening particularly in smaller communities is that the community newspaper is winking out. It's disappearing, or it's becoming thinner and thinner, or it's becoming a monthly, if at all. And we've seen closures because of the failure of advertising at the local level, because of business closures because of COVID. So that's what's prompting a number of these operations to be doing news operations suddenly, is because there's this gaping hole for community information, and they're the only entity that's left.
Yeah, and to that point, there's a trust issue that practitioners are navigating with some of their potential partners. I was talking to a colleague a few weeks ago, and she said, yes, Antoine, there's a gap, there's a need for us to like step in here and start working with, journalists who worked at the former paper, but can we trust them? Because of the angle that we want, the way that we want to tell the story is not the way that newsroom usually told stories about the community. And everyone pretty much on here is all familiar with that struggle. So I just wanted to add that in there too, that's a part of the reality that we're in.
It's really interesting. There's also, of course, some of these larger city collaborations like Resolve Philadelphia that involve a community outlet as part of a larger outlet that as a part of a larger collaboration that could have like television and major newspapers involved as well. So a lot going on. I just want to draw everyone's attention to the chat, which we'll save and share around with folks if they're interested, because people are putting some useful things in there. Michelle Ferrier put a link in there to some work on getting back to Letrell's point about different tactics of reaching people, using postcards and direct post. And Madeleine, who we're going to hear from in just a few minutes, is mentioned that El Timpano, her project, has been using SMS to reach audiences, Latinx and Mayan immigrants in Oakland, to answer their questions. And also, let's see, Michelle's Your Voice Ohio. Michelle, do you want to just jump in? I don't see you, but.
Hi there, I'm here. I'm just muted. Hi, no, I just wanted to jump in and just mention the two projects that I put in the chat. The Your Voice Ohio project, which was a collaboration with the Jefferson Center and quite a few media outlets across platforms in Ohio that ran through the 2016 election and into 2018, 2019. And really focused on understanding the community's needs and information needs, and then collaboratively working together across platforms to get that messaging out. That was one of the key things that we learned in the Media Seeds project that I did in Southeast Ohio, which was an engaged project, was that we were working in areas with broadband access problems, cellular access problems, all kinds of issues, and ultimately came to the conclusion that we had to work across platforms and mediums. And so using postcards, using Facebook groups, using street signs, using posters, and all other kinds of methods that we had to be creative in making sure the messages got in front of people who didn't have access to the internet or cell phone, and mobile and text was difficult to get as well. And so some solutions, if you Google either Your Voice Ohio or the Media Seeds project, some of this information has been written up in reports about what we learned in terms of distribution and audience, but also about how journalists need to rethink their own posture to their work and their position in the community, not as objective observers, but taking on a different role and posture in the community. So the work goes much deeper than just looking at distribution, but also looking at how we do our work and our relationship to the community, very deeply tied to the health and welfare of that community. So I invite you to take a look at some of that. And thank you, Andrea, for letting me jump in.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for sharing that. Also, you might want to check out Ernesto Aguilar has shared other collaborations, including efforts in Ampers, Minnesota, and Rocky Mountain Community Radio. I want us to actually go ahead and we're going to do a small group discussion about this. But in particular, I want us to think about how has the pandemic and/or the uprisings changed how you either are doing or will be doing engagement with communities or research with them. So I know for us doing research in Germantown, we've had to shift to doing online focus groups and the different kinds of dynamics that entails. And I know there's some other folks on this call who've been doing some really interesting work, and I'd love to have them have a chance to share some of that. So if you've developed strategies that you're hoping to take with you post-pandemic in particular, we want to take a moment to think about that, either for how you do your research or how you do your engagement with communities. What have you either tried or you're thinking of trying? So we're going to break up into some small groups, and if one person from each group can take notes, maybe whoever's name starts at the closest to the top of the alphabet. And if you want to paste your notes in the chat, that would be awesome. You don't have to, but that would be great. And we'll share back a little bit with the time that we have at the end. But I'm going to go ahead and start the breakout groups. So don't go away. Hope you can join in on them.
Andrea, how much time do we have in breakout?
Good question. We're running a hair late, but at least 10 minutes, maybe a little more. I'll give you a warning. I'll try not to cut you off super abruptly, but I apologize if I do.
And while Andrea is breaking everyone up into groups, I just want to say we've done these Zoom meetings a couple of times where we introduce the breakout groups. I have a feeling that some people find them a little bit awkward at first and are a little bit hesitant to give them a real shake. Please do so. I found that the people who sit them out and really give them a good chance are really grateful that they did so. And this is such a great group of people. So
yeah, and then we've got researchers, we've got practitioners, we've got all kinds of folks on this call. So meet each other, have fun. All right, see you soon. Hopefully you've met some people that you can follow up with if you'd like. We're gonna have more opportunities for another breakout later on. All right, I think we're pretty much all back. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry if I disrupted your conversation. I hope you made notes of who you were talking to. And we'll try to facilitate connections later on. But I wanted to give a quick moment for anyone who wanted to share some of what they'd been discussing. If anybody had any strategies they've been using that they think they're going to be able to take away from this. And I briefly lurked in on one of the groups, and I don't know, Fiona, if I can put you on the spot, because you mentioned this idea of doing research in the COVID context and having ambassadors to help you do it. And I was wondering if you could maybe share that quickly.
Yeah, it may be a little premature to share since we haven't publicly shared it yet, but I'm doing some community listening work with American Journalism Project, and we were starting the community listening project in Houston right as the pandemic hit. So I could not, and I preach the gospel of in-person engagement, right? So everything I do is geared toward that. But I had also been working with Cassie Haynes at Resolve on some ideas that around how do we tap into thinking about leadership development, because through a kind of organizing lens, how do we develop leadership in the community to do this work? And that talking to white lady researcher is very different than talking to someone that you know. So we had developed some of those ideas looking at kind of collaborative ethnography models. And in Houston, there happens to be a really rich network of community leadership development projects all over the city for all kinds of community groups. It could be public health, it could be environmental justice, it could be, just neighborhood level stuff. And so tapping into that and being able to find people, we hired them, we paid them $20 an hour, which is pretty good money, especially, it's not a lot of work, but it's, I wanted it to be real. And they did conversations with people that they knew in their networks in whatever language and on whatever platform worked for them, which finding that out was also information that was useful, right? So we had a really talented researcher I found named Chi Zhang that I found through Daniela Gershon, who does research on WeChat. And she's able to have conversations in language on a platform that I can't access. I mean, I can get WeChat, but I can't understand, I can't communicate. So I think, having that multiple languages and multiple platforms, we had some people that were reaching out to their friends on WhatsApp and some people who were, still meeting over the garden fence and stuff like that. So I think thinking about reaching people where they are sometimes means getting someone who is where they are and working with them.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. Anyone else want to share from their group? I know we see some things in the chat, a lot of discussion about how we can have better definitions for some of these concepts, like engaged journalism, solutions journalism, community journalism. We've got some, anybody want to jump in and verbally share? I can't read out all the recaps, but you can look in your chat to see. But if you,
Andrea, I was just going to jump in because I too was working with American Press Institute and a team of folks in Wisconsin on some engaged projects again as COVID hit, and worked with API to share with all of their projects some strategies for using walled garden spaces, whether it's Facebook groups or Nextdoor or other kinds of existing neighborhood channels, as well as other kinds of ways they may engage both virtually online in face-to-face synchronous conversations, as well as asynchronous kinds of work using the web, as well as postcards and other kinds of physical distribution to home. And so some of that information, I posted a link in the chat to some of the research around building those kinds of community tools that go beyond news and information that typically is circulating in newsrooms, to provide a conversation and dialogue space for community people to talk to each other. And that was one of the key insights from all of the projects that I've worked on, was that the spaces like Facebook groups and Nextdoor and others, while problematic sometimes in their racial profiling, they are valuable places where people do share information, barter, get recommendations and things like that, which is kind of really the fodder and the bottom plankton in the media ecosystem, are people sharing what they have and what they know. And so I put in the link one of the articles talking about virtual vines and ways to build these conversation spaces in digital spaces.
thank you. This is great. There's a lot of rich stuff going on in the chat right now, and I'm not going to do it justice, and we have just a couple of seconds left. Did anyone want to verbally share anything from their group that they haven't already shared in the chat, or like to summarize something that they've shared? Max, you've shared a lot in the chat. Do you want to do a quick nutshell of it?
Yeah, I was taking pretty copious notes from our group. We had a digital news site operator living in New York, focusing on Indonesia, and for many of the readers of that publication, being able to chat over Zoom is now much more comfortable. We have a researcher describing some conversations with participatory journalists and community reporters in favelas in Brazil. All sorts of really cool ideas for getting the word out about accurate information when a government is trying to repress that information. Shout out to Mary. Mike, as always, has incredibly efficient and thought-provoking ways of describing what's going on by community media organizations, people dealing with increased pressure with decreased stamina and support. And then from the Local Voices Network side of things, we've been having just dozens and dozens of community conversations with people who geographically could never have gotten together in the same place before, and who are sharing similar concerns and issues in rural parts of their states. And it's been amazing to be able to share some of those stories in the conversations themselves from people in other places. So for example, if there's a group of folks getting together in Birmingham, Alabama, we can share stories from conversations in rural Wisconsin that people can respond to and react to, and recognize there are similarities as well as differences in their experiences, prompting more further discussion.
It's really interesting. And several of you have shared about, Danya shared also that, something about some people are attending things that online that they wouldn't attend in real life. And so there might be some things that we can kind of think about going forward that we might want to keep from this pandemic. Hopefully there's a lot that we're not going to keep, but some things that can be positives out of this. I'm actually going to go ahead and we're going to shift gears a bit here. I'll remind everybody that, please keep sharing things in the chat, because we'll save these and circulate them. Because there's a lot of great resources, and just to have some of the names that you've listed in here, it's really helpful. But we're going to shift gears from talking and thinking about how this moment has affected the quality and the connection with communities, to talking about how the heck are we going to pay for this work. I'll hand it over to Jake.
Great. Okay. So yeah, just to go off what Andrew was saying, please keep.
I'll paste some links in there too.
Yeah, I was about to. Okay, great. Andrew's gonna put some links in the chat. Please feel free to keep adding to the chat. I'm actually putting a link into the chat as well. So if you scroll up in the chat, a few chats up, there's something from Jessica Maria Ross that is the participatory journalism playbook that looks like it might be a really great resource for those of us that are trying to figure out how to actually define terms like participatory journalism and engaged journalism and things like that, since it seems like that's something that we've all been trying to figure out. I also just threw something into the chat that is a link to an academic article that is written by one of the attendees here, Raul Ferro Canil. So Raul, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but this is something that came out really recently. It's something that I think does an incredibly comprehensive job tackling what audience engagement and engaged journalism means to different stakeholders within the space. It's likely behind a paywall. So if it is, Earl, if you want to put your email address in the chat, maybe people can reach out to you to get like a PDF of the article. It's something that I just think is really interesting and might be worth people's time. Okay.
It's open access, but thanks for the plug.
Oh, it is open access. Okay, well then, terrific. So then you can put your email address in there if you want, but people can just read it if they want to without having to reach out to him. Okay, so yeah, now we're going to shift gears a little bit. Just for a little bit of context, when Andrea and I put these conferences together, we find that typically our dynamic is that she's the one talking about all of the incredible work that is being done in this space that is really innovative and really sensible as a way to make journalism more equitable and just better, which is the reason why this first hour was about the quality of journalism. And then I'm the buzzkill that will say things like, okay, but how will we figure out a way to support that work? How do we find a business model that can get journalism out of the incredibly precarious and unstable position that it finds itself in right now? And the reason why we wanted to touch on this in this conference is because it seems like that instability has only gotten worse because of coronavirus. And as a result, it seems like there's even more desperation and consequently more willingness for journalism stakeholders on the research side and on the industry side to think about and talk about big changes that we should be considering and making to this space. So the two that I have been thinking a lot about lately, one of those changes is something that's been unfolding for a while, but seems like it maybe is getting even faster and more prevalent, which is just audience support for journalism. The other seems like it has for a long time been something that many, at least from my perspective, in the US considered something that would never happen, but is increasingly becoming something that people think might be the best solution, which is publicly funded journalism. And it's that public funded journalism model that our two next speakers are going to talk quite a bit about. So we're first going to hear from Madeleine Bair, the New Voices campaign manager for Free Press. She and her colleagues have led a grassroots campaign to invest public funding in local news and civic information initiatives, particularly ones that serve historically overlooked communities. And as we mentioned before, she's also the founder of El Timpano, a community journalism project serving Latinx communities in Oakland, California. And then after that, we're going to hear from Victor Pickard, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication and the co-director for the Media, Inequality, and Change Center. He's written a lot about the appeal of a publicly funded model for journalism. Most recently in his book, Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society. This is a book that I highly recommend. I was one of the naysayers before I read this book, thinking that this model would never work in the US. And after reading it, I've totally changed my mind and think it might actually be the best path forward for journalism's business model. Okay, so with that, I will pass things off to Madeleine.
Great. Hi, good morning. Yes, let's talk big changes. Thank you so much, Jacob and Andrea. Let me try to share my screen. And so, can you all see that? Yes, okay, great. Yes, funding for journalism is something that I think a lot about, both as a campaign manager for Free Press and as a media entrepreneur myself. And I've been working on the issue a bit more intensively in the past 5 months or so. This is the first time I've been asked to talk about a lot of those thoughts in 5 minutes or less. So I hope that this is coherent and resonant. Please be gentle. But yes, we're talking about how to fund local news, which can seem like a pivot from how do we create practices of listening and trust with the communities that newsrooms serve. But I want to actually make the case that the two are very much intertwined. And before we get to specific proposals to fund journalism, I think it's really important to understand what is the problem that needs to be solved? Why are we calling for a transformation? And what are the roots of that problem? And when I say the problem, I don't mean how are revenue models failing to generate sustainable funding for news, but how are revenue models at odds with the public service mission of journalism? And I'm actually going to start 250 years ago with what I acknowledge is a startling image. This posting is notable not only for the slave owner who posted it in the Virginia Gazette, Thomas Jefferson, but for the fact that this was one of thousands of paid advertisements in the 18th century that provided a consistent source of revenue for newspapers. Slave ads were essentially among the original classifieds. And I want to say that telling and reckoning with this history is part of a major Free Press project to be launched in the next few weeks, examining the role that news media has played in upholding white supremacy in the US. And that project is led by my colleagues Colette Watson, Joe Torres, and Alicia Bell. And so there will be much more to come on that history. But for the sake of today's discussion, I think it's important to recognize in a conversation of funding the news, the fact that the business model of journalism in the US was founded on a system of human exploitation. And as one scholar of this history wrote, print culture, that is newspaper culture, was inextricable from the culture of slavery, just as print capitalism was slavery's capitalism. And so the remnants of this culture and this system can be today with revenue generators like mugshot galleries and sensational clickbait. These are practices that are exploitative, dehumanizing, and erode trust in journalism, yet have become cornerstones of the digital economy of online news. And so where else have commercial imperatives taken journalism? One result is scale. And today, papers responsible for half of daily print circulation across the country are owned by 3 giant hedge funds with no interest or commitment to the public service mission of local news. Another result is inequity. And so whether nonprofit or for-profit, publishers must make a calculation about when it makes sense to produce news for a community, depending on whether revenue streams from advertisements to memberships, live events, or local philanthropy will sustain it. And one study of online news outlets across the country found that the one common denominator of all of the outlets that had attained sustainability is that they served affluent communities. So it's no wonder that poor communities, communities of color, and rural communities are most impacted by the decline in local news. So here we are in the ever illuminating year of 2020, when public health journalists reporting during a pandemic are being laid off as their news outlets struggle to survive. For many communities, the absence of local news has left a void easily filled by misinformation. And the uprisings for Black lives and racial justice force us to ask how the systems in our society have served to perpetuate racism and inequality. And the commercial model of journalism is one of those systems. And so Free Press envisions a transformation in how we fund local news. What I invite you to consider is, what does that look like? What would it look like to fund news as a public good? To invest in journalism, not as a commercial enterprise with all of the pressures of scale and revenue generation, but as part of the infrastructure that keeps a local community healthy at all times, but especially during a crisis, like a community health clinic or a food bank, and that's responsive to the needs of local communities. And so we have a few thoughts that I'm happy to discuss and to share some Free Press proposals in the chat. But I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing your thoughts. And I will say, I leave with this question, not simply as a way of skirting a discussion of our own proposals, but because asking this question of all of you asking this question of your communities, really must be a key component of developing funding to local communities.
That was great. Thank you so much, Madeleine. That's actually such a great segue into Victor's presentation, since it ends up on a question that I believe Victor will attempt to answer in some way. So Victor, do you want to get started?
First, I'll unmute myself. Yes, I'm eager to jump in. I'll try to share my screen here. I have just a few slides to go along with the talk. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Excellent. All right. I want to thank Andrea and Jake for organizing this, and thank you all for engaging in this discussion. I'm amazed with all the great people who are here today. Much of what I'm about to discuss really is just repeating what Madeleine just said. I just want to say +1 to the way that she framed that. I'm going to be trying to reduce a 40-minute book talk into 5 minutes, so I'm going to go very quickly through some key points. 3 points that I want to lift up at the very beginning. One is that I think one of our objectives should be to try to create systemic fixes. So to try to strive for a universal journalism so that we're not just talking about what works in the big cities, to actually try to penetrate the news and media deserts that we see across the country. So that's one of my main agendas. I also think, and Madeleine nailed this point, but I think it's very important to underscore that commercial journalism has always been crisis prone. It wasn't just the internet, it wasn't just the pandemic. And also it has always written out entire communities, especially communities of color. I really like the framing of how we need to look at how commercial journalism has served to sustain and perpetuate white supremacy. That's such a key point. And the third theme I want to lift up is that this crisis that we're in is also an opportunity to try to restructure our entire news media system. So those are the very modest goals that I've set out for myself and for many of us who wish to join in those goals. Jake already put in a plug, so just one more shameless plug for further reading. I have a book out where I go into more depth. I'm not going to do justice to any of these points in this very brief discussion. But basically, if you go back to the earlier financial crisis, 2008, 2009, there have been these four general buckets, these four very overlapping models that have been kicked around. This is a crude typology, but the idea that if the advertising model no longer works, and I think there's now consensus on that point that there's no returning to that 150-year-old business model, then perhaps we can go to another commercial or semi-commercial model of audience support that Jake mentioned earlier, and there are many different variations of that, or citizen journalism, the idea that we no longer need institutions or professional journalists. This more utopian ideal has faded to some degree, or the idea that we can rely on nonprofit support from foundations and so-called benevolent billionaires. And I'm very clear in my book that all these models have some strengths and weaknesses, but if we're going to focus on that universal goal, the universal service mission, then I think public media subsidies are our last best hope. But of course, those are the most politically fraught in the US. And I always trot out this graph to show, this is based on Benson, Powers, and Neff's data, showing that the US is literally off the chart for how little we allocate towards our public media system per person per year. It comes out to about $1.40, so the price of a cheap cup of coffee, perhaps. Why does this matter? It means that in the US, we don't have a social safety net for when the market fails to support the level of journalism that democracy needs. So what's to be done with this problem? I'm very clear that we have to both decommercialize to as much as possible, take journalism out of the market. We need to seek out non-market means of support, but we also need to democratize. And so much of what we've already been discussing today are all these different initiatives of how we can create new democratic forms of journalism. And there are 5 general approaches to doing this. The one I've already hinted at, establishing public options, that's the one I'm really hitting on, but also breaking up monopolies, for example, preventing private equity firms from buying up struggling newspapers. The thorniest approach is regulating news outlets. I think we have to be cautious with that, but there could be public service obligations. Enabling, so those 3 are sort of top down, then the 2 bottom up would be enabling worker control so that the journalists themselves own and control, govern their newsrooms, and also community control of newsrooms. But this keeps coming back to this idea that for a systemic fix, we have to create a new public media system or a public support system that maintains these community newsrooms across the country. There are always 3 concerns that come up with this. How do we pay for it? That's something that we can get into in discussion, but there's so many different ways of doing this, from having citizen tax vouchers, to taxing the platforms, to repurposing already existing subsidies. How do we make sure it remains independent? How do we ensure that people will trust it? Those are the 2 that I'm just going to elaborate on here for a moment. And again, I think we've already hit on some of these ideas, but if you break out a public media system into 5 discrete layers: funding, how do we pay for it? Governance, how will those resources be allocated? How will we govern the new newsrooms of the future? The ascertainment layer, how do we determine what the information needs are? Where are the news deserts? Again, how do we allocate the resources? Infrastructure layer, so that we're not just talking about the journalists and the content that they are producing, but also looking at the necessary infrastructure, everything from having public spaces to having broadband access. And a couple ideas that I've been trying to promote, this idea of converting post offices into community media centers would be one example, but also public libraries, public universities. So this idea of leveraging already existing public infrastructure towards supporting the journalism that we need. And the 5th one sort of goes without saying, but the idea that at every level of news governance and news production, local communities, and again, the journalists themselves have to be driving that process. So when we talk about journalist-owned newsrooms, for example, not just the idea that they should be unionized, which they should be, but also they do things like elect their own editors. So we really need to think about radically democratizing these new institutions that I think will emerge if we create these new structures, this new kind of institutional support, which again goes back to the public media subsidies. And as much as there is so much doom and gloom, and I don't want to be the buzzkill that Jake had mentioned earlier, that is often his role. I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we're already seeing some of these experiments happen, and we're seeing a shift in the broader debate around the future of journalism. So on that cheerful note, I will end. Thank you for listening. So I will stop.
Thank you so much, Victor and Madeleine, for those great presentations. So we're gonna open it up to questions, and yeah, these can be questions about anything from how to actually use, how to pursue public funded model, what to do in the meantime. While we're waiting for people to put questions in the chat, the question that I have, Victor, is what do you think, you know, in my mind, this is sort of a moment of mobilization because of just how bad the pandemic has made things. Is that a realistic way of looking at it? Like, do you see that this is an opportunity for really great change because this is just such a crazy time in general?
I do. I absolutely think that. I mean, I think that was already happening. Of course, pre-pandemic, we had already lost over 50% of our newsroom employees across the country. So the pandemic has just accelerated this. But certainly this idea that journalism is an essential service, that the market won't support it, that we need to come up with alternatives, that has created an opportunity to at least, you know, discursively shift the conversation. My one concern is that there have been, even among policymakers and in Congress, they've been talking about subsidizing newsrooms, but unfortunately too often that's seen as a way to prop up the existing commercial outlets. And so I think our task is to try to link this new opportunity with this idea that we need to create something entirely different. And you know, that's what we have to keep underscoring. And too often when people hear me talk, they think I want to just go back to some golden age of journalism. And I try to put it in neon, that journalism has never been great. We've always left out entire communities, and we don't want to go back to that. So we really need to think about creating something better that can hopefully emerge from the ashes of the old.
So this is a follow-up question to that, but I'm going to ask it to Madeleine, because Madeleine, it seems like in your role, you're actually tending to sort of make those changes on the ground within the industry. You're trying to convince stakeholders that these big changes are possible and should also be pursued. How do you do that? How do you get stakeholders within this space to get that you're not just trying to return to some romanticized notion of how good things were, which is totally inaccurate, as you and Victor both pointed out, but actually make things very different and in doing so much better?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think one way of doing that is by really broadening our understanding of the stakeholders. So there are a lot of campaigns going on right now to quote unquote save local news, that some of which are being successful in making headway with policy proposals on the Hill, or in different states like California. And they are really defining the stakeholders as news publishers, and that, you know, these particular publishers, our outlets, need to be saved. And that is not something that's going to resonate with communities that have really seen those news outlets leave them behind, or who simply no longer have a news outlet that is serving their needs. And so, you know, when Free Press launched a campaign for a radically new model for funding local news in New Jersey, the Civic Information Consortium, we really found our strongest allies not in journalists and newsrooms, but in a really broad and diverse array of community organizations on the ground, from unions to immigrant organizations, the League of Women Voters, people who could really understand and tie the issue of the lack of and decline of local news for their communities to their own experience. And that's very different than making an argument saying save this newspaper. when that newspaper is already at a distance of your own personal experience.
So it sort of seems like you're actually answering the question that Letrell put in the chat, but in case you might want to add to it. So Letrell asked, he said, public funding won't necessarily result in better coverage of traditionally marginalized communities. How can we connect issues of fair representation to a public funding model? So Madeleine, do you want to tackle that first, then Victor?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And you know, the way that the Civic Information Consortium works is really through a public engagement process, so that we really, before even drafting legislation, we heard from community members on the ground from various communities across New Jersey to really understand, as many of you do in the community reporting projects that you're involved in, to really hear from them, what are the news needs that your community is facing? What are the stories that haven't been told in your communities? How can newsrooms better reach you through the tools and technologies and languages that your communities use? And those answers can really drive the funding and really drove the design of that legislation itself, so that it would fund projects that are really unique to specific communities, rather than a broad policy proposal that would, you know, just fund news outlets that look like a printed newspaper with advertisement, but instead could really fund initiatives that are driven by needs and the strengths of local communities.
Yeah, if I could just add a bit to that, because I absolutely agree, Letrell is spot on for raising that question, and that's also why I try to be absolutely clear that it's not just about decommercializing and publicly funding journalism, but we have to democratize it. And the new newsrooms must look like the communities that they serve. But there are things that we can do to try to also structurally encourage that. And one of the reasons why I chose the word ascertainment is that that was also the name of one of my favorite, all-time favorite public interest obligations for broadcasters, which was thrown out during the Reagan administration. But basically for broadcasters to maintain their, their monopolistic control over the public airwaves, they had to go into local communities and canvass them and find out what those communities wanted to hear and see on the public airwaves. And in my ideal, these publicly funded news cooperatives of the future would be mandated to go in order to get their subsidies, would be mandated to go into local communities and constantly have those kind of town hall meetings. And Letrell, I was struck by what you said with your research showing that when there was this constant direct engagement, there was an increase in public trust in their local news institutions. And I think that's a key insight, because that always comes up. How do we make sure that people will trust this new public media system? And I think if we have this constant community engagement, that's going to go a long way towards ensuring that there is that trust.
So John, you've got a question in the chat that I think is interesting. Do you want to actually maybe just ask it yourself, just because I want to make sure that I'm getting if you're asking about like sort of the political slants of this model or something different?
Yeah, I'm just curious how many of these efforts, how many sort of green shoots we see in kind of red America versus blue America. And my worry, and I'm sure everybody here would probably agree, is that many of these really important efforts will sprout up in liberal cities and places like Philadelphia, New York, and Austin, and that we won't get the message across the political divide. And by message, I mean everything Victor's saying, like amen, democratization, new funding mechanisms, etc.
I have a very quick comment to make, but I would want to hear more from Madeleine, because she's really been on the ground organizing communities and can speak more clearly to this. But just, I think it's important to note that polling data shows that even in the reddest states, even among conservatives who hate the media, often care deeply about their local media, about their local broadcasting, local newspapers. So I think that's a potential leverage point. But also I think we have to be open-minded that when we create this new system, not every new outlet is going to be like, Democracy Now! We're going to have a real mix on the ideological spectrum. Now around issues related to racism and things like that, that's going to be a real problem that we're going to have to, that was a problem with the early days of the public broadcasting system, especially in the South, where you had public broadcasting outlets that were overtly racist. And, that's something that we have to grapple with. But in generally, the newsrooms should really reflect the local communities.
Yeah, I would just say we are seeing support among policy proposals that are designed to strengthen local news among Democrats and Republican legislators, both in Congress and in state legislators. To go back to the Civic Info Consortium, one reason that passed was because it had bipartisan support. Going back to Victor's point, legislators have witnessed that, the press conferences that used to be full now only have 1 or 2 reporters, and they themselves need to get messages across to their constituents. So they do care about the decline of local news in their states. We're seeing one piece of legislation that we're following and advocating for in Massachusetts right now would establish a commission to study journalism in underserved communities across the state. And it too has bipartisan support. And it's another place where we've seen mayors speak out about the fact that there's simply no more news in their city. That's something they care about. It's something their constituents care about. So it is a nonpartisan issue.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question from the chat because I don't want to cut too much into our breakout session time. But this is from Ava. And I think this is just a really interesting question. It seems like what she's basically asking is a publicly funded option for journalism inevitably going to lead to a more democratic press? Is the issue funding of the news, or is it the distribution of the news? And Ava, I don't know, do you want to maybe say a little bit more about that question, since I want to make sure that I'm doing it justice?
Yeah, no, that does it justice. I think, right, like on a local news level, I really understand the public funded model. I think that recently I've just been kind of alarmed when I start to piece together how national news outlets are talking about their company and their mission. It seems because it was so commercially based for so long, they no longer even view it really as something that needs to hold on to those journalistic values as strongly as they have in the past, because they're trying to turn it into something that can get those clicks, that is going to compete with these tech platforms. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts.
I'll jump in very quick and just simply, I think that's a great question. We have studies showing us now that when a community loses its local newspaper, that community tends to become more polarized because people are relying more on those national outlets, especially like the cable television outlets, for example. So I don't know if I don't know how much. I think we can try to compete with those national outlets, but more importantly, if we have strong local journalism, I think people won't be as affected by Fox News, for example. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it is an important step. And I'm always very clear that having a publicly funded media system is not the panacea to all of our woes, but I think it's a necessary baseline. It's a necessary starting point to make sure that we can fund the actual journalism that democracy requires.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main points I was trying to make in my presentation is that, the commercialization of media and of journalism has led to journalism that really is not reflective of the public mission and interests of the communities that newsrooms serve. And so public funding is a way to address those gaps and to alleviate news outlets from that need to generate revenue.
This is great. Thank you so much for the great questions, and Madeleine, Victor, thank you again for the presentations and the really thoughtful answers. We are going to break now into our second and last breakout session. I am putting the discussion question into the chat, so you'll be able to see it when you break out into your group. We'll be in this for about like 10-ish minutes, and then come back for a final share back. And in addition to these questions that I put in the chat, Alaya also had a really great question that he put in the chat earlier that I wish I had had time to get to about scaling up publicly funded journalism. And that's something else to be thinking about as you're having these conversations. So yeah, Andrea will break us up into groups. And for those of you that I didn't get to in the chat, I'm sorry, there's a lot of really great stuff here, and we'll make sure to send this out to everyone after the meeting. People are beginning to trickle back in. Welcome back, everyone. So while people are coming back, would anyone like to share what they were talking about? And while someone is actually talking, for those of you that aren't talking or would be more comfortable sharing in the Zoom, please feel free to put stuff in there too.
I'll jump in on our group because I think a question I posed in the chat right before we popped into breakouts dominated some of our conversation, which is really if journalism is to help ensure democracy, and yet we are not operating in a democracy, and our elected officials are not the ones who have any clue about what's happening at the local level. How can we design a system for each community that isn't a scaled solution, isn't the huge newsroom, isn't saving journalism, but really about how do we create a healthy communication ecosystem that helps communities to heal and thrive. And unfortunately, I think the conversation has been dominated by how do we save journalism, meaning newsrooms and the way in which we've done it in the past, when I think what's called for right now in this moment is radical reinvention of what we do, how we do it, and where we do it, and with whom. And so structurally, I think we're asking the wrong questions if we're focusing on replicating a journalism model that looks like the newsrooms of today.
I think that's a great question. I mean, just because, Victor, you've got democracy in the title of your book, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask if you could talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between the conversations that we're having about improving the quality and sustainability of journalism with the very legitimate concerns that we all have about the condition of democracy, at least within the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and Michelle, I'm glad you asked it. It's a daunting one. I mean, I do think we keep hearing this, though, that I don't think anyone in this discussion that I'm aware of thinks we just need to prop up the status quo. I think everyone here is talking about creating something entirely different. So I do think that's a point of consensus, but you're right that a key insight from the political economic literature is that newsrooms, news organizations are always going to reflect the broader political structure in which they are embedded. So the fact that we are in an illiberal democracy at the moment and have been for some time, even before Trump, I think that, or at least we've had very severe problems. I think that's something that we have to wrestle with, and not to make it sound too simplistic, but it's also why we need radical reform across the board. It's not just our newsrooms, it's our political processes. There has to be structural transformation in all of our core systems. So I agree that this is a very daunting task, but also I don't think any of those structural reforms are possible without a viable news and information infrastructure. So it's sort of like a chicken egg dialectical process that we have to grapple with. But I do think, and this goes back to Madeleine's point that I also make very clear in my work, is that we have to unhook journalism from the commercial imperatives that have basically performed a kind of news redlining for decades, basically ensuring that lower socioeconomic groups and communities of color are not part of the news media system. So that's, and we see that with our digital divide as well. So again, very large, complex problems. I'm sorry, I don't have any solutions, except we do need this structural transformation.
No, I know I put you on the spot, but I did not expect the answer. But very quickly, Madeleine, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well, just because I'm sure that you are hearing these similar concerns voiced by the people that you're talking to about pursuing this kind of model, considering we live in a time where there are such deep reservations about the state of our democracy.
Whew, yeah. My goodness, I can try. You know, my mind goes to really what I learned while doing an information ecosystem assessment here in Oakland to understand how Latino and Mayan immigrants really take part in civic conversations here in Oakland and how they are left out. And, you know, due to the lack of Spanish language, local Spanish language media and information that reaches these communities, that that provides a platform for them to raise questions and raise their voices, and that simply lets folks know about things like community forums, you know, town halls by the local city council members. There is essentially no centralized channel for that information for folks who don't speak English or who don't use emails and computers as primary sources of information. And those are really key ways that entire communities are being left out of the democratic process, just here in my own community in Oakland. And so, and in, you know, in developing El Tímpano and trying to get funding for it, one thing that I've heard many times from potential funders is, we don't see how this can scale. And it's true, you know, this is not a scalable enterprise. It is very much designed around the local needs of a local community. So I'm not sure kind of how that answers your question. It's really just my own observations as to the challenges of both philanthropy and the commercial imperatives of local news, really perpetuating inequities.
Thank you both. And yeah, I realize that it's pretty unfair in the last few minutes of the presentation to say, okay, now don't just fix journalism, but also fix democracy. So I appreciate you sharing your perspective. Okay, we are running really close to time and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to hand things back over to Andrea, Madeleine, and Victor. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for this really great discussion.
Thank you all. And yeah, sorry we didn't solve all of the problems of journalism, capitalism, everything in this 2 hours. I think we made a valiant effort, and a 2-hour Zoom is tough. So, you know, that's what we could do. But I really appreciate everyone sharing their time with us today. We'll be sharing around a note to you all. We've recorded this. We're also going to share the chat. We'll also share a little question for you about what we do next, because this is actually the second year we've done a conversation like this. Last time it was thankfully in person. Hopefully it will be in person again next year. If we do this at AAJMC next year, that would be New Orleans. But I think we also want to be mindful that not everybody can go there. And so we'll be thinking about, you know, what we might want to do. We've also been doing some intermediary like check-ins, and like we had been doing monthly conversations that might, as we both have very small, or Jake's about to have a baby, and anyhow, so we're probably gonna do not monthly, but maybe quarterly. I don't know. We want to get your ideas for what would be useful to have these sorts of conversations to brainstorm to keep things going. So we'll be asking you for your feedback from us. I'll make one last shameless promotion of something coming up on the 24th if you want to join in. I'm going to do a book thing with the Tao Center, and you'll be hearing from some great folks, some of whom have been on this call, like Jessica Maria Ross. We'll also hear from Sarah Alvarez and Alicia Bell, who've been doing some really amazing work with communities in Detroit and Sacramento and Charlotte. So I hope you can join us. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks to all of you, and thanks to all of our sponsors in the AEJMC for letting us do this. And lovely to see you all. Take care and have a good day. Bye.